Manuals are a fickle mistress, but I've been obsessed with them ever since I was a little BMX grom, watching riders like Chase Hawk and Mike Aiken ripping manuals around, and knew from that age that it's a trick I wanted to be good at. So over the past decade or so of riding around on bikes, I've put countless hours into learning manuals. And today I'm going to share with you 5 tips that I've learned along the way that will help you master manuals if you haven't gotten there just yet. My first tip for learning how to manual is one I'm sure you've heard before, and that's to practice. It really does take a ton of practice to learn these kind of finesse tricks like manuals and wheelies. But I'm going to take this a step further and tell you a little bit of a story. See, I started riding BMX when I was 11, 12 years old and got pretty good at it pretty fast. My nickname as a kid was Kamikaze Kirchhoff because I would just huck myself off of everything and was never afraid to hit big jumps and try big tricks. And remember how I said earlier that I looked up to those riders who are really good at manuals? Well, I didn't learn them at a young age because I didn't have the patience to just go out there and practice. I learned 360s and no-handers and no-footed cans because those were tricks you just had to do once and hope it worked. But I didn't learn the finesse tricks like manuals until I got a little bit older, got a little more self-control, and could take the time to practice. So if my teenage self sounds like you and you just can't see yourself going out there and taking the countless hours that it takes to learn manuals, then I would suggest maybe learning some different tricks. There's plenty of super rad mountain bike tricks that really don't take a ton of practice, just take a little bit of balls. One relatively simple trick that I'd recommend if you're in that category is the crank flip. Once you get over the fear of bashing your shins, it's actually really easy. So to summarize my first tip, if you want to learn to manual, you really do have to put aside the time and practice consistently. For me, what I found to be helpful was trying to get out 5 or so days a week and spending about a half an hour each day. And that brings me to my second tip, which is practice in the correct way. I talk to a lot of people who are like, yeah, every time I go on a trail ride, I practice doing some manuals through some of the flatter sections of trail. And that's great, and maybe there's some people out there who can learn manuals like that, but I was not one of them. For me, learning manuals took deliberate practice where I was only focusing on the manual. And I think one of the best places to do that is a parking lot. Parking lots act as like a natural ruler. You've got the parking spaces, which you can use to measure how far you've gone and to track your progression. Those parking spaces also provide a really good visual cue, more on that in a second, but that just helps you stay, again, focused on the manual and not distracted by the trees zipping past you or you're gonna fall off the single track trail. So if you really want to master manuals, go out there and try that. Head to a parking lot, set a benchmark, right? See how far you can manual right now. And I bet you're going to find that that will improve pretty quickly if you're practicing those first 2 tips. Tip number 3 is all about getting over the mental hurdle of the fear of looping out. And it's something that everybody has to do. Thankfully, however, there's a super easy, simple drill that you can do anywhere, like a concrete pad by your house, that will help you get over that fear super fast. And that's to do this. Hop on your bike and loop out. That easy. But in all seriousness, if you practice this drill, I guarantee that it'll make you better at manuals overnight. Our brains, obviously, have unlimited control over our muscles. So if we've got fear in our head, our brain's not gonna let our muscles do the things that we need to do to learn a manual. So the next time you go out and do one of your 30-minute dedicated manual practice sessions, try that. Intentionally try to pull the front end of the bike up too far that you fall off the back of the bike. It will be scary at first, but I promise that fear won't last long. You'll learn pretty quickly that it's not very hard to just jump off over your back seat and land on the ground. Now, most of you probably know that you can use your back brake to go ahead and lower that front end back onto the ground again, but I actually want you to practice the skill of jumping off the back of the bike. Again, we're trying to get the whole fear idea out of our head. And if we're scared that we have to catch ourselves with the brake, otherwise we're gonna fall on our butt, then it's not gonna do us any good. Like I said a second ago, I really do think that this loop out drill is the most important thing that you can do to learn manuals. And if you try this and have success, let me know in the comments. I'd love to celebrate that with you. If you try it and break your tailbone, I'm sorry, please don't sue me. Remember what I said earlier about those parking spaces acting as a visual reference for your eyes? Well, that's my 4th tip. Once you start getting to the point where you can consistently manual 20 or 30 feet, you'll start to find that the manual likes to sway from side to side, and that will typically end up in you losing the manual and that front end coming back down. Now, you could, of course, just learn how to steer your manual, but that's a pretty complicated skill that I still have trouble with. What I do instead is I pick a reference point in front of me with my eyes, and I focus right on that. If you've ever done other balance sports like gymnastics or played around in a slack line, You've probably been taught that picking a point out in front of you and focusing on that will help you maintain, I guess, like equilibrium with that point and keep you from swaying side to side. And the same thing goes with manuals. I've also found that that visual reference almost acts as like a goal in my head. So say I've got a point in front of me, maybe 50 or 60 feet out, that I want a manual to. It's weird, but I find when I'm looking at that point, I'm more likely to get to that point. And I've learned to do the same thing when I take manuals out to my trail rides. Say there's a double I want to manual through or a bridge I want to manual across. I'll focus on a point directly in front of me on the other side of the obstacle I want to manual through, and that helps me get through it. If you're putting all 4 of those tips to the test already and you're still struggling with getting your manuals down, it could be your bike. And I almost didn't include this in the video because I kind of hate this idea that I can't manual because of the bike I'm on. I hear it a lot, that the only reason I'm good at manuals is because I ride a hardtail. And frankly, that's not true. These other 4 things have a lot more to do with learning manuals than simply being on the right bike. That said, it's gonna be a heck of a lot easier to learn manuals on a BMX bike or a dirt jumper than it is on a downhill bike or a big enduro bike. And there's quite a few factors that make that the case. Number 1, not having suspension in the back means that you're a lot more, connected to the frame. The suspension kind of absorbs your body's input, so you have to exaggerate those motions a little more the more suspension you have in the back of the bike. The other factors all come down to frame geometry, and there's a couple things on a frame that will make it easier or harder to manual. The 2 biggest ones being the chainstay length and the bottom bracket drop. Your chainstay is essentially a fulcrum that rotates around your bottom bracket. The longer that fulcrum is, the more effort it takes to lift it up and to rotate it around. But there is a flip side to that, and that is that the longer that fulcrum or chainstay is, the bigger the balance point is in the middle. Super short chainstay bikes like BMX bikes are really easy to get to that manual, but then they're really easy to loop out too. A longer chainstayed mountain bike, on the other hand, will take more effort to pull it up into that balance point, but there's kind of more wiggle room once you're there. The other piece of geometry that's really going to affect your manuals is bottom bracket drop. That's essentially how low your bottom bracket is beneath your rear axle. The more bottom bracket drop you have, the harder it's going to be to manual. The way that I like to picture this is going back to that whole fulcrum rotating around the bottom bracket. And I've actually got a little prop here to help out with this. Let's just say that if the stick is parallel to the ground, that's essentially a bottom bracket drop of 0. Your bottom bracket and your axle are perfectly aligned. Let's also say that 45 degrees, halfway to 90, is the balance point. Now, that won't always be the case. There's other things on your bike that will affect that, but to keep the math easy, we'll call it 45 degrees. Now, the lower your bottom bracket is below your rear axle, the farther you're gonna have to lift the front end up to get to that 45 degrees. And this is, again, another reason why it's so easy to manual on BMX bikes. Because they have such small wheels, they actually don't have any bottom bracket drop. They have bottom bracket rise. So their bottom bracket is always higher than their rear axle, just so the cranks don't hit the ground. Modern mountain bikes, however, with their big 27.5 and 29-inch wheels, have to lift that bottom bracket up. Otherwise, you'd feel really unstable and your center of gravity would be super high. And that whole issue with bottom bracket drop is the reason that when you see guys on downhill bikes or big enduro bikes doing manuals, their front end seems like it's way higher off the ground than when you watch a BMX rider whose front wheel is only a couple inches off the ground. They simply have to lift that bike up further to get into that balance point than when you do with a higher bottom bracket. So just like all things, there is a trade-off here where the lower that bottom bracket is, the more stable your bike will feel, but the higher it is, the more poppy it'll be and the easier it'll be to manual. I tend to try and find bikes with as little bottom bracket drop as possible. I run 165mm cranks, so I'm not as worried about pedal strikes, and I really like the feel of that high bottom bracket. Just feels more like a BMX bike and it's easy to pick that front end up. This, of course, is personal preference, and again, you can learn to manual on any bike. So there you have it. 5 tips to help you improve your manuals. I'd love to hear more about your journey to learn manuals, so if you have any specific questions for me, go ahead and drop those in the comments. While you're down there, if you could hit the like and the subscribe, that would mean a lot to our channel. After that, you know what to do. Hop on your bike, get out there and practice manuals because it takes a ton of practice, and hopefully, I'll see you out there.